So is the GameCube the ultimate Game Boy? I'm going to be talking about that in this video. So the original Game Boy was a massive success for Nintendo, and they eventually ended up releasing what they called the Super Game Boy for the Super Nintendo, which would allow you to play your Game Boy games on the TV just by plugging in that cartridge, and then there was a slot to put your Game Boy games in. And with the GameCube, they did something similar, and that's with the Game Boy Player, but they took it a step further, and this time around you can play not only Game Boy games, but Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance as well, using this attachment on the bottom, which just plugs into one of the extra ports, and then it has screws that kind of clamp it down in place just to keep it more stable. So one thing to keep in mind if you're looking into maybe getting a Game Boy player is that it requires a way to actually start up the game. So originally it came bundled with a startup disc, which if you're looking at US copies, they are going for insane amounts of money. I don't know, I think they're just rare and in kind of high demand for collectors, so the prices are going to be ridiculous, and which is why I actually swapped it over from my silver GameCube, my US GameCube, to my Japanese GameCube here to pick up an actual copy of the Game Boy Player. So if you don't want to get a Japanese GameCube, or you don't want to pay the insane prices of a US copy of the disc, then there are workarounds. The one that I had before this was, it was a memory card that actually allowed you to boot it up. If you started Animal Crossing and went inside the house and turned on the NES, it would boot up the Game Boy player. Why is this my favorite way to play Game Boy games? Probably right next to the original model Game Boy Advance. I really do like the form factor of that one, and I have a really nice backlit screen mod for that. But this is probably my preferred method. I like console gaming. I like sitting down, I like playing games on a TV, and this is just a great way to go. Of course, you also have other options like the Super Nintendo, for example, as well as Nintendo Switch Online, but keep in mind that the libraries on both of those are pretty limited, as you don't have access to the full Game Boy library with Super Nintendo. Does it do Game Boy Color? I don't think it does. I think it just does Game Boy original games. And that's a great option as well if you have a Super Nintendo. But if you want the full library, except for probably a handful of games, I don't think every game actually works on this, but most of them definitely do. And this is a great option. So, yeah. And then with Nintendo Switch Online, of course, that's just a limited library because over time they're adding more and more titles, but it's never going to get to the same amount of this. And I prefer collecting physical games as opposed to just playing them digitally, even though I do have digital games. One controller option that I think is a must-have if you're going to be doing this is the Retrobit gamepad right here, which is made to be very similar to something like a Super Nintendo controller. And this is great. You know, it's got a great D-pad, it's got shoulder buttons, and it's got the same button layout as the GameCube controller, but it works really well with the games that I've played, and this overall is just a very, very solid controller and one that I would highly recommend, especially if you're looking to get a Game Boy player. I'm going to get this all plugged in and just show what it looks like playing some games. So I've got it hooked up all ready to go here, so when you want to play a game, just take a cartridge and face it label down and insert it into the bottom there. And then when you're done and want to swap it out, there's a cool ejector on the side and it'll just shoot out the cartridge. And that way, you can swap it out with another game and be ready to go just like that. But you do also want to have the disc inserted as well, so it actually starts up the game. Once you start up a game, it also gives you some customization options. If you hit the purple Z button, it pulls up this menu which allows you to change the border. If you want, there's a ton of different options. And you can also zoom in, there's some button layout changes you can make. And you can also, if you go to the very right here, if you press this, then it'll actually let you replace the cartridge without having to turn off your console. And there you go. You're playing Game Boy games on a TV. And yeah, so I'll just show some gameplay of a bunch of different games using the Game Boy player.